And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And I'm C. Derick Varn.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This time we are continuing our discussion of... what are we actually discussing? We're discussing Chapter 6 of Frans Osinga's book called Science, Strategy and War, The Scientific Theory of John Boyd, which is about John Boyd, who's the actual subject of the show. There we go.
There's lots of meta in this one.
Yeah, we're on a couple of layers of we're on a couple of layers of analysis removed from the actual thing. This in the previous episode, we introduced this whole John Boyd thing, and we had a look at the section of the chapter that was about destruction and creation. This time, we're going to move on to patterns of conflict, in which Osinga walks us through a slide deck that Boyd had prepared to present to the military folks, and this is one of his big masterworks. And it's a hell of a section. So I doubt we're going to get through all of it in this episode.
Yeah, I was about to say, for a slide deck, this is like a book on grand strategy that requires you to have read about 20 other books.
It's a lot, because Osinga will just kind of throw away a line. It's like, oh yeah, and then Boyd spends 17 slides discussing early German maneuvers against France and the Low Countries. And it's like, 17 fucking slides? Jesus Christ.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. His audience would be familiar with all of this stuff from officer school, right?
Yeah, I guess so. So this section will be, Patterns of Conflict is kind of structured as... It's kind of an elaboration of the core theory that Boyd is always working with, coupled to a historical analysis. This is where he kind of brings in historical examples. And I'll quote from the introduction here that the mission of Patterns of Conflict is fourfold: to make manifest the nature of moral, mental, physical conflict, to discern a pattern for successful operations, to help generalize tactics and strategy, and to find a basis for grand strategy. And the intent is nothing less than to unveil the character of conflict, survival, and conquest. A lot of emphasis will be placed on the moral, mental, physical nature of conflict. And to kind of spoil the ending, Boyd really emphasizes the moral, mental dimension. Basically that, I think we talked about it a little bit last time, but like the attrition style of warfare where you just take a big hammer and you smack a big rock with it, that's kind of a parlor trick. Anyone can smack a rock, but outwitting and outmaneuvering an enemy and disrupting them to the point where they collapse without necessarily ever needing to fight them, that's a hell of a trick, and that's where our efforts should be focused.
In the OODA loop, the second section is the Orient section, and last episode we talked about how Boyd says that's the most important one, and accordingly it means that it is also the biggest target for you to attack. So if your orientation is strong and their orientation can be weakened, that is a big target that you can hit. Yeah.
It's also probably the things that you, like observation and orientation are the things that you can screw with the most. Whereas it's harder to break down the enemy's ability to decide. But if you can scramble their circuits such that they can't observe the world accurately and they can't orient themselves, then you can induce basically collapse into confusion and disorder. You can create an environment that's changing so rapidly that they can't keep track of things. And that's what will defeat them.
That is how you do the whole decision thing, actually, is messing with the first two. Because otherwise people are just going to make a decision, even arbitrarily. But if you don't know what's going on, can't really make a decision, or in decision that you make may not actually be the decision that you're making. So,
or to kind of draw an example from pop culture, perhaps, if you could think of like the film Aliens, where the squad are kind of like crawling through this, alien infested tunnels, and suddenly the aliens start coming out of the walls and they're scrambling all over the place, and at some point the troopers are just firing wildly into the air. That's their decision, is to just start pulling the trigger and firing anywhere. But they're being swarmed and overwhelmed by all these like skittering monstrous sort of things. That's a highly Boydian way of engaging.
One thing I think we're going to have to deal with here, though, is the view on human nature. I think we're going to find seemingly Darwinian and Hobbesian, but there's a lot of points where Boyd seems to like drop into basically virtue thinking.
Yep, absolutely. The more sophisticated his thinking gets, the less Hobbesian it is. So I think there's a considerable gap between what we covered last time with destruction and creation and the conclusions that Boyd comes to in this patterns of conflict section.
No, I just think it's interesting because the Hobbesian assumptions of this seem to apply to the states, but the internal cultures of these states is really going to affect the O and the ODA loop. So, and those aren't Hobbesian. Like, and they seem to. It seems to be implied they can't be in things function.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, and that's just where we want to. I think it's interesting too when we start with Sun Tzu and then go to Napoleon because it does feel like, hey, no one was writing about war for 1,500 years. Whenever you see this stuff.
Yeah, so Derick, you could kick us off on the historical snapshots section here with the path from Schunze to Napoleon.
Well, I mean, Boyd starts off with this idea that the Eastern commanders from Sun Tzu forward are much better at war because they avoid fighting and protracted war and are aimed at reducing casualties for all sides. And so you have a lot of focus on stuff like, the appearance of harmony, deception, speed, dispersion, and shock tactics. And he points out specifically what Sun Tzu advocates, which is probe the enemy's organization and disposition to master strengths. Basically, build a model of the thought world and the virtue set of your enemy, and then play to their perceptions and biases. Attack the enemy's plans as opposed to just attacking the enemy. And he explicitly mentions Sheng and Qie, I think. My Mandarin's crap. And the 37 maneuvers, which are all about, throwing people off expectations. Now, when he switches to Western commanders, basically it's Genghis Khan, nothing. And also, it's kind of weird to consider Genghis Khan a Western commander. That's a different question. Napoleon. And then from Napoleon forward, stupid, according to Boyd, stupid for 200 years. And then World War I basically forces people to not be stupid because the attrition warfare becomes too costly. But I mean, I think it's interesting because it's what I found interesting about this and Boyd's when we get to the historical stuff later, is he picks up that, for example, Lenin and Mao, have their theories of warfare and do a lot with that, and they have some interesting insights. But if you look at what Lenin and Mao's, particularly Lenin's model of war was, it was Napoleonic. And that's also how they structured their party. Was this German Central Command thing. And when I pointed out to people that, a lot of stuff doesn't work that way, even in military planning, and yet you guys are still telling people in the 21st century that form of centralization is optimal, Boyd would just laugh at them, I think.
Yeah, that shit is clown shoes. It's fucking ridiculous. Oh, Christ. Yeah, I mean, so the thing then that happens with Napoleon is that there's a kind of interesting thing here where Napoleon inherits a fairly dynamic and self-organized military from the revolution, but then under Napoleon's leadership, it centralizes and becomes shit, and that's when they start losing.
Yeah, so this is even Osinga notes that this is a disputed interpretation of what actually happened of the history of what Napoleon did and how the army changed. But this is the way that Boyd is presenting it. Like, basically, Napoleon is this kind of hinge figure where in his early career, he had that flexibility and dynamism of the sort of the army of merit, the revolutionary army. And then in the latter part of his military career, he was much less flexible and started to commit all of the sins that would, represent attrition warfare up until the First World War.
Do we think that's true? I don't know, and I know the time period pretty well, but for example, by the time the Napoleonic army crushes the Habsburgs, is it already centralized?
Yes, I believe that is one of the things that's mentioned in the footnotes. That's the Austerlitz battle, right? I think that's like sort of the beginning of that era. I think that he's mentioning. Yeah.
So as well as the centralization, the other thing that Boyd is harping on here is the transition from having high variety units with high variety maneuvers, which sow confusion among the enemy, and then that transitioning towards having stereotyped units, like big formations of the same shit over and over again, and backing up with artillery, which is a low variety kind of army with a low variety like maneuvers.
Which is World War One.
Mm-hmm. That's getting in that direction. Yeah.
And the sort of the point that Boyd's critics make that sort of doesn't really disprove his overall point is that Napoleon's opponents started to learn from his tactics. And so he adapted to face his own tactics. And so that's kind of where he got into this stereotyped point. So it may just be that, the sort of genius of maneuver warfare shifted away from Napoleon to someone else, but it doesn't mean that Napoleon's original tactics were bad or that they were invalidated by the later period. So yeah.
I think there's a point somewhere around here as well that I think is really important and interesting, that one of the big problems with the centralization effort was that what it kind of did was, again, the way it's framed by Boyd is that it kind of robbed the lower levels of the forces, like it robbed the ground units of their autonomy and their kind of dynamism, but preserved the dynamism. Dynamism was still present, and self-organization was still present, but only in the central command. So the top of the army reserves its autonomy and its ability to make rich decisions, but kind of strips out the same stuff from the lower ranks. So you get more towards a force that's supposed to be highly stereotyped and highly rigid, except for the top, where they reserve all the shiny playthings up there.
Yeah, and you see this later in the Prussian general staff. They were quite creative. They used lots of war games to maintain that dynamism. They were quite innovative. But of course, we don't really see that sort of creative and dynamic culture as being characteristic of the army as a whole. It's just that inside circle of intellectuals and that have that dynamism.
And does he say this is kind of this is a pathology of the aristocratic mind, basically, that this is or it's a pathology of aristocratic culture, that the officer aristocracy kind of class had to reserve those kind of dynamic privileges for themselves and kind of strip them from everyone else below them?
I think it's that, and it's also seeing soldiers as expendable, in a very basically just seeing them as a different kind of being that isn't really human in the same way that you are, is part of the pathology. Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing when you look at the technological development, which makes war much more of a meat grinder. When you think about even from, let's say, the British Empire up through the Napoleonic Wars, war is brutal, and even brutal on civilian populations. But and they were basing a lot of their formations off of phalanx models with guns, which is when I realized that as an adult, I was like, oh, that's why they did that. That's stupid. But I get why they're doing it now, because they're treating, like, obviously the heavy armored cavalry stuff is not relevant in the same way that it would have been before projectile weapons. So where are we at? Oh, let's revert back to Roman and phalanx forms, but with guns.
Well, because a gun is just a long spear, right? You know.
Right. But that, I mean, like, if you look at the early modern military formations, and you realize, oh, that's what they're doing, because they think they can pull directly from classics how to do warfare. So what I'm thinking about this, the thing that's not mentioned directly that's interesting, though, is this spurs on a lot of technological innovation, this attrition warfare model, because the only place as an aristocrat you can really innovate is in tactics or in machinery. You can't innovate an individual like, soldiery, because they're expendable anyway, and if you can't predict what they're doing, how can you be this innovative super general? So that also undermines the efficacy of the infantry, because the infantry are just basically meat cogs, and that's also a way to demoralize your army incredibly quickly. And you see a shift in the attitudes of war, particularly when you start doing this with massive conscript armies, which really begins in the European theater, around this time. It's when you go back to huge amounts of conscript soldiery, whereas for basically 1,000 years, and from late antique to early modern, warfare is an aristocrat's game almost entirely, with some peasants being involved. But if you take too many peasants out, you don't have food. So the entire calculus is on how you expend people are different. So the class mentality, actually, the aristocratic mentality, somewhat makes sense when your primary warriors are just other aristocrats. And yeah, that might fuck up the peasantry, but they're not going to go and just strategically sacrifice it all, because then they can't eat. And that's a completely different calculus. And what's interesting is Boyd's focus on tactics means he doesn't really see this as part of what's driving these strategic developments.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that I think your point about the class character of this form of warfare, and the point that that Boyd makes here is really visible in the difference between the American Revolutionary Army and the European armies of the same era at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, where, yeah, the American Revolutionary Army was, they had to develop all of these new methods of instruction, tactics, all kinds of things to deal with fairly unruly people who were volunteering or had a much greater degree of autonomy than European soldiers did. Whereas the European method was extremely brutal and top down. And that was, of course, based on the aristocratic model, where the soldiery are basically objects that you move around a chessboard. Well, especially if you have them in infantry squares, right, where they just become shapes that you can move around. Whereas the American method was, it emphasized more the understanding of the soldier and all this kind of stuff. Just as a matter of necessity, they had to do that because people wouldn't listen to them otherwise. They'd just go off into the woods somewhere. I remember in Mike Duncan's biography of de Tocqueville, he talks about how when de Tocqueville was working with the Americans, they were following that American model. But when he came back to France and he was trying to lead the Revolutionary Army forces, he just like fell back into the old aristocratic way of doing things and like completely sabotaged his entire political chances at the start of the revolution, because his men hated him and would not fight for him. Whereas, they loved him when he was in America because it was a very different way of doing things. So just being surrounded by that aristocratic context really meant that there was a different way of doing war. And yeah, I suppose the dynamic Napoleon that Boyd idolizes is probably also a product of that democratic impulse that meant that the way of doing war had to change, because otherwise the soldiers would not be effective, because they had more autonomy.
So, like in a class society like that, the center of gravity is towards this attrition, aristocratic style of warfare, unless there's some countervailing force, such as the fact that the Americans were dealing with people who are essentially wild dogs and would just run off and not bother to deal with them if they ever pissed them off, or if so the army that Napoleon inherits from the Revolution is tempered a little bit differently, but then in the absence of those kind of counter pressures, it all just kind of gravitates towards the aristocratic attrition style.
Yeah, and it should be said that sort of getting to what Derick, what you said, this is like a aristocratic form of war in more of a mass society, right? Like it's an aristocratic form of war where you have a sufficient surplus that you can be quite wanton in your expenditure of human life. And you're not living on the margins of the like very narrow margins of agricultural production. So it's like the aristocrats trying to control a mass of humanity that is not quite in the position they were in during the Middle Ages.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the historical playing this out, this is actually more than any singular revolution. What destroys aristocratic culture in Europe is that their way of doing war totally delegitimizes them with a mass public, which is significantly larger than them, and also doesn't really need them anymore. And except for government protections, they can't really. They also are not the only people with swords and horses now. I mean, so like, there's a very real sense in which this development of weaponry seems to be a way to maintain a monopoly on war powers. But it doesn't really work out for the aristocrats because they're not really trained to make this stuff.
Plus, like, if you look at, for example, the British case, so many of them are killed in the attrition warfare in World War I. Like the aristocrats do not escape the meat grinder in World War I, for the British at least.
I've just been thinking of the fourth season of Blackadder, in which Lord General Melchett, Stephen Fry's character, is unequivocally framed as a pampered imbecile who's just feeding his people into a meat grinder obliviously, like episode after episode. Is that like delegitimization and stuff is extremely palpable by the time you get to filming that series, where it's a kind of completely accepted thing that these people absolutely fucking blew it and are seen as an essentially evil presence.
Well, yeah, and it was actually this reactionary impulse against the leveling effect of firearms that led Japan to ban them during the period of sakoku, or isolation. Like the destruction of the firearms and really extreme gun control was basically there to prevent this delegitimization of the aristocracy.
Right, which is interesting, right? Because right-wing talking points about gun control are actually right about that, but they're in the wrong time.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because now people have nukes, so that's all irrelevant.
Yeah, you're gonna go buy a nuke, like something out of fucking Snow Crash, you know. But there is a little bit a section a little bit later about the sort of nightmare of the Industrial Revolution and what it does to warfare. But before we get to that, Boyd has some critiques of Clausewitz and Jomini. So Kyle, what's his kind of beef with these folks?
Right. So Clausewitz was a kind of observer and student of Napoleon's method of war, and obviously very, very influential, continues to be influential to this day. And Boyd criticizes Clausewitz as being too focused on the latter Napoleon, so the less dynamic, more aristocratic, more attrition-focused Napoleon, and thus missing the point of Napoleon's genius. So Clausewitz's doctrine is focusing on exhausting the enemy, so basically undermining their ability to act. It puts the emphasis on that final point in the OODA loop. It's focused on identifying centers of gravity and smashing them. So find the points where they are strongest and destroy them. It focuses on main operations, so large-scale operations. It has a focus on speed. Of course, like marching faster, having faster logistics, all that kind of stuff. The emphasis is on seeking a major battle and winning it. So draw your enemy into a decisive conflict and smash them there. This is the doctrine. The aim is the destruction of enemy forces, and of course this leads to a bloodbath because you are seeking to inflict a high body count on your enemy, which will cause them to give up the fight. So Boyd says instead we should seek to disrupt and confuse enemy communications. So disrupt and confuse enemy communications, that is the linkages between points of gravity or centers of gravity, not those centers themselves. Sever and isolate multiple centers of gravity, discoordinate them so that they fall apart, and confuse and terrify the enemy. So again, attack that orient point in the OODA loop first and foremost.
So it's conspicuously about like slicing up the enemy's nervous system rather than attacking the organs necessarily.
Yeah, the way I think about it is essentially if you think about the VSM, the viable system model, and the way that it is a model of physiology and not anatomy, it is a model of the functional connections of a system, not of the material components of it. The Boydian doctrine is essentially like to use the VSM as like a manual for what to attack, right? You want to attack those systems, those VSM systems. You don't want to attack like the meat, right? you want to be like a kind of like a nervous system disorder, not a localized cancer or something like that, right? Yeah.
Right. Which is interesting. There's a couple of things that this changes that I think should be really addressed, because this is also the heart of counterinsurgency theory, and insurgency theory, and this comes up in 5th Gen warfare text. So if you've ever read William Lind, it comes up. What I would say is that one of the things Clausewitz assumes that's just kind of frankly stupid is that the stakes are the same for both sides, because the political annihilation is inevitable. But even at the time period before full industrial revolution, you look at the United States, the United States, the U.S. Army, the Union Army during that time period was kind of shit, and one of the reasons why was that, and part of its motivation and part of the moral fighting core, and that'll come up later, but part of it is also it was based on an attrition model, and the South was also kind of based on an attrition model. But the South was fighting in its home turf, so its logic for fighting was actually more severe, because it saw itself as defending everything, not just defending some political concept. And the casualties taken during most of the war were 2-to-1, 2 times the dead of the Union, and how Grant won that war, in particular, is one Sherman leasing, basically doing proto-Boydinism with a terror tactic, of just totally trying to disrupt the supply chain. And the other reason was that Grant had no, for all the benefits of Ulysses S. Grant, he had no problem throwing a whole bunch of Irish immigrants into a meat grinder. And that's effectively what he did. So, but this led to bad instincts later on. So if you look at like insurgency tactics, one of the reasons why occupations and all the colonial governments failed is they took this Clausewitz model, and they thought since they could inflict 5 to 10 times the casualties, they were ensured to win. But the Clausewitz model doesn't factor in difference in motivation. And difference in the game of winning. So all you have to do as an insurgency is cause enough attrition to make it too costly to maintain the occupation. That's a completely different calculation than causing enough attrition where the army will, in the case of an occupied state, will literally let itself die. Clausewitz doesn't deal with any of that. It's not in his calculations as he was commonly interpreted.
I mean, do you see the same thing happening in like the American War of Independence, where the British were overextended across an ocean and they could always just fuck off back to England and call it quits, whereas
that's why the most powerful army in the world did not beat a bunch of ragtag guerrillas who were not particularly well trained, and if we're completely honest, didn't have particularly good leadership either. Like Washington was kind of a mediocre general.
Yeah, and the guerrillas were hungry because they were on their home turf and fighting for everything, whereas the Brits were like, yeah, fuck this, we're out.
Right, and the only reason the Brits probably fought as hard as they did, frankly, was colonials who were fighting for them. But they were not in charge most of the time. So, the third of the United States, it was still loyalist, and then, you bastards in Canada.
So those asymmetries matter hugely.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the Quebecois and their allies, they were impossible to defeat because a number of factors, but one of the most important ones was that, at a level of morale and orientation, they were just vastly superior to the American forces that were invading. Because not because they were fighting for the British Crown, but because they were fighting on home turf, and
they were fighting for Quebec.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Or for what was left of Arcadia against some English-speaking bastards who had already screwed them over. And I mean, another thing I think people and Americans don't ever learn about that part of the war, but I think you really see these stakes really changing. For example, in the War of 1812, where the U.S. tries to finish liberating its colonial brethren in the North. And again, it's always funny when you go back and read U.S. textbooks, because they usually clean up the references to Canadian colonies. Because I was reading De Quebecois once, and he's advocating for the U.S. side, and he's mentioning Nova Scotia joining the Union. And all that stuff is just no one ever discusses that was even a possibility.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, the 13 colonies. I'm like, yeah, but we didn't just want it to be 13. We wanted Ontario and Quebec and Nova Scotia too. But anyway, but in 1812, you see that when you start fighting the colonials on their home turf as an invading force, the Proto-Canadians win, and win big, because the stakes are completely different, and they're kind of in charge of their own war effort, which they weren't in the Revolutionary War. So these factors really matter, and Clausewitz-style warfare doesn't really address them at all,
and it doesn't address Napoleon's failures in Spain, right? Which is the sort of the most obvious, like, direct connection, right? The guerrilla warfare that he had to face in Spain.
He addresses it in Russia, but not in Spain, and it's kind of a big deal.
And, like, as to why this is all relevant for this show and this kind of project is, I mean, what did we say earlier, that, like, basically all of the left are Clausewitzians at this point? And
we said that off air, but I said it.
Need to get their fucking head together on this stuff.
Everything is mass movements and decisive mass battles and winning through attrition. It's smashing centers of gravity, even though they're not thinking about it in terms of war, they're thinking about it in terms of voting, and also, when they try to do something sneaky like the dirty break, they announce it to the entire fucking world as if the enemy isn't listening, which is dumb. So they're not even good Clausewitzians, but I mean, like, their instincts are from that period, partly because, if we're completely honest, the strategies the left developed politically are from a time period where these are the dominant war methods. And I point this out, for example, on protesting. Originally, protesting up through and including Gandhi is about one thing. The reason why you field the protest is that you are saying, I have enough people to field an insurrectionary army if you ignore the petition.
That's what a demonstration is. It's a demonstration of potential force. That's why it's called a demonstration. Yeah.
Right, but now this has all become, like, forgotten habit of leftists, and they like, well, why don't these protests work? Well, they're not, none of that's relevant anymore. Like in mass power warfare, I can mow down a demonstration of even 1 million people in maybe a couple hours. It's a few bombs and a drone strike. I mean, like, I don't think people remotely understand that, but our time period where we develop these strategies are the time period leading up to Lenin. That's it's in it, and you see it in the Marxist metaphors. All the Marxist political metaphors, all of them are like Napoleonic, Prussian Central Staff, this, that, and the other. And it's interesting because, as we're going to get to in a little while, but like, Boyd realizes that Lenin and Mao, even though they talk this way, they don't actually do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. They do something actually pretty damn effective. So after Clausewitz, Boyd takes a swing at this guy, Jomini,
who I didn't know much about, actually.
There isn't much here about him either, really. It's just that this guy had a similar sort of problems to Clausewitz. He was a bit better in some ways, that he has this emphasis on freedom of movement and communications. But I think this is an interesting critique. He's critiqued for being too occupied with the forms of operation and the spatial arrangement of forces, and still basically doesn't get the point that Boyd is getting to. But he's kind of skipped over in that there's a common flaw here. It's this like emphasis on adaptability and freedom at the top, but the stereotyping and rigidity at the bottom that we were talking about, this aristocratic form of warfare.
Honestly, this was like George Washington's failure as a general too, right? You see a list with a lot of bad generals. They get obsessed with the forms of operation and spatial arrangement of forces, and they do these like really elaborate maneuvers because they want to be special smart boys, but it's not actually the best form of generalship.
I wonder, it sort of set me off thinking about when we were reading the stuff about the Capitalocene and that kind of like ocular cadastral sort of bias in like seeing shapes and arrangements from above, that sort of stuff. I wonder if there's something similar going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also like these people were often trained in manuals that describe the exploits of Roman generals in the form of these kind of spatial movements, and that, yeah, and they thought, like, like the true form of warfare is what you learn from the textbook about Roman generals.
It's geometry. The true warfare is geometry.
I mean, this is what I was saying earlier about all those early modern armies walking in phalanx formation. Like, it's exactly where they got that from. What's interesting is I think Joe Meany, I was just looking him up because I'm like, I bet you if I went to West Point, I would know who he was. And like, yeah, I would. Apparently he's major still. He's the person who came up with the term logistics. So that's him. He's an aristocrat, surprise. But one who was he was a kind of a bourgeois aristocrat, actually, who had a business career, but was not very good at it. And then got involved with the Swiss Army and the Helvetic Republic. And I think it's very interesting that our entire time period, where everybody's studying these people, is early modern and late early modern, and people aren't used to this taxonomy. That's like basically end of feudal empires, the beginning of the republics. But that's also before the Industrial Revolution, and that's where all these people come from. And it just seems disastrous that we still teach this stuff actually post-Industrial Revolution.
And like that reaches its apex in this little microsection on the kind of curse of the Industrial Revolution, right? That this kind of aristocratic form of warfare kind of gets amplified by several orders of magnitude by the introduction of the railroad, machine gun, artillery, barbed wire, masses of hardware, masses of manpower. This mass manufacture just becoming mass slaughter, and it is that kind of fusion of mass industrial society with this kind of aristocratic class mode of control, producing it's stereotyped tactics, stereotyped units, and stereotyped strategy. It's total variety collapse, and then the technology is really just a bigger club. You're fighting with primitive tools that are dialed up to 11, which of course leads to this heinous destruction of human life. And yeah, I think in this section, it's this kind of attrition warfare is framed as a pathology of aristocratic culture. And that's like World War I being this like huge collision of all these kinds of different tendencies that just, I don't know, it's fucking incredible. And like, I don't know, so much of the ghastly shit that we still have is still from this, like the kind of, because that kind of aristocratic mode of thinking and the kind of fusion with mass industry is the like germinal seeds of like fascistic thought. And I don't know, there's so much fucking ugly shit that spills out from here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's yeah, that's a lot of what fascism as a culture is about, right? Is like reveling in that shit, but also like wanting to transcend the aristocracy at the same time.
It is in many ways modernist reactionaryism, which I think is something when people talk about like, are Nazis right or left? Well, both and neither. And that's why, and you can kind of see this in the way they conceive of war, which is these mass battles of speed, which they understand, but they're still kind of mass attrition battles. And it would be very interesting to actually study outside of the Wehrmacht fascist military tactics, because outside of Germany, they actually seem to be stupid. So, I mean, Germany's actually the interesting exception to it. Like, I'm thinking about like the Romanian Guard, the Phalange. The Phalange can beat the Republic, but only because the Republic itself is being idiotic and is self-divided and can't maintain unity. Not because the Phalange is a particularly good army. There's stuff like that.
Yeah, basically without exception, the fascists outside of Germany are pretty hopeless at fighting. Yeah.
Interesting. So there's a kind of thing here where, like, because this is the apex of, like, this mass aristocratic style of warfare being the stupidest and most destructive style of warfare, and it also did this kind of time period, this, like, concept of the mass industrial sort of stuff is also where a lot of the left's imagination still is. Like, there's something really troubling about all this, that, like, it's not just that our ideas are completely out of date, but they're out of date from a time period that was also extremely fucking stupid and destructive. And I don't know, there's a couple of layers of failure going on there.
Well, I mean, like, for example, the organizational models of leftists, when they're not based on centralized military units like the Prussian army, which we could talk about why that's dumb, they're based on factory models, which, like, don't really... I mean, factories don't work like... Even modern factories don't work like early 20th century or 19th century factories. That's why it always feels like... I mean, even in leftist analysis, and I'm not going to go too far because this will get us, like, completely off, but, like, they're always fighting the last periodization, the last categorization. So, for example, like, the whole everything is neoliberal trend really probably only popped up in leftism as a major discussion point after neoliberalism is on the way out, which I think is, like, in 2007 is when you really start seeing the shift away from it, and people are like, "What?" And I'm like, "Yeah, quantitative easing, man." But
Yeah, and well, it's very interesting, right? Because, like, I think the places where I find the most discussion of neoliberalism are, like, like, I find way more emphasis on neoliberalism, say, here in the Netherlands than I would in Canada, because, like, they're kind of, like, still somewhat stuck in that battle between social democracy and neoliberalism, whereas, like, most places have moved on from that at this point.
But if you look at, like, left discussion, and it was like that way with Fordism too, when everybody was throwing post-Fordism around in the aughts, like, it had been dead for 2 decades. So I think this orientational loop, now some of this is like the loops of academia, but our instincts and our understandings of periodizations, our instincts on mass politics are all stuck in this time period. And even when they, like, learn from Lenin or Mao, and like one of the things I'll say about this is the OODA loop is very useful when you for battles that aren't actual shooting wars. Certain guerrilla tactics actually aren't. Like, they're really shooting war only tactics. So it's just, yeah, it's a very interesting thing to see, and it's also interesting to me how left thinkers are stuck in this, and the ones that win for whatever reason tend to still talk this way and actually tend to think they are thinking this way, but do something else because of constraints. And if you look at what I think, the reason why I say they still kind of think this way, if you look at, like, the way the Leninists organized the state and society in Russia, it actually is like a Clausewitzian army. The teleological orientation debates, if people don't know what that is, they should go look it up, is very much based on taking the ideas of the Prussian central staff and applying it to statecraft to build up developmental models, and it was a fucking disaster. So, like,
oh Jesus. Yeah, so let's move on to rediscovering flexibility, where Boyd will walk us through from World War I attrition all the way up to more contemporary infiltration and guerrilla tactics. So Kyle, what's the infiltration stuff here with the Germans specifically?
Right. So this is the kind of, like, German innovations in warfare that happen when they realize that they're really on the back foot, and maybe the Americans are going to join the war, like, they've got to be creative, right? They've got to come up with some different strategies and different tactics.
And so this is World War II, right? This is the Nazis.
No, this is World War One.
No, okay, cool, gotcha. That wasn't entirely clear from the text.
Right. So so they do some kinds of like tactical innovations around infiltration. So imagine, these are the battlefields mostly of Western Europe. I think he's talking about here, which were much more stymied than the ones in the East. The ones in the East were similar, but not entirely the same. So they use things like brief, intense barrages. With, of course, the famous gas and smoke for hiding their forces and disrupting the enemy's ability to observe them. They sent out many small swarms of light fire teams, and their theory was to seep into the cracks of the enemy line and flow behind them. These were the kind of like the famous shock troopers, right? The lean, fast, and dispersed that did an eruption of many thrusts through the enemy line, and then through the weaknesses that they could find, creating breakthroughs. So again, this is in contrast to massing a huge number of troops and doing a big push that would start with the announcement of a massive artillery barrage and then just send out an unfathomable number of people to die in no man's land.
Right. Which is what the French and the English do. And again, to bring up the material constraints for why the Germans couldn't do this, because I do think it's important to understand why they innovated this way. They didn't have an empire full of bodies they could just throw out at people.
So the key points here were to disrupt enemy mental processes, create an ominous threat. So either the gas as a weapon of terror, or small teams traveling through smoke and coming to stab you to death in the trenches. Right, this is quite ominous. Very scary. It's based on first disrupting the enemy and then destroying them. And dynamism is importantly pushed down to the squad level as opposed to the general staff level. And Boyd defines the essence of infiltration tactics as clouding or distorting the signature and improving mobility to avoid fire, yet focusing effort on penetrating, shattering, enveloping, and mopping up disconnected or isolated debris of the adversary system. The intent is to exploit tactical dispersion in a focused way to gain tactical success and expand it into a grand tactical success, or what we would call an operational level success. So larger than the level of a squad or a unit, but smaller than a full theater level. So this in turn implies in yet more abstract terms that small units exploiting tactical dispersion in a focused way rather than large formations abiding by the so-called principle of concentration penetrate the adversary to generate many non-cooperative or isolated centers of gravity as a basis to magnify friction, paralyze effort, and bring about adversary collapse.
I love the phrasing of all that because it's slice up their nervous system. It's really well phrased. Boyd has a real flair for like ominous and threatening language, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, and I like this idea of non-cooperative centers of gravity because it kind of suggests like a sort of like a planetary system or a solar system that is like out of control, or the gravitational opposition is actually tearing it apart.
Well, like the thing you'll see in like a science fiction thing or something where you blow up a spaceship by like attacking one of its engines so that it like flies out or like shakes the ship apart or something like that, It's like the systems that are supposed to be cooperative with each other have become non-cooperative. They've been disaggregated. They've kind of been discoordinated by your efforts, and it's the machine will shake itself apart if you can get it into that kind of state.
So what's interesting too is this is useful for thinking about what you're building after the war, which I don't think anyone, one of Boyd's point about attrition warfare that I think is implied is that the attrition also perpetuates the conflict because the brutality is so high. So like you have the wars can be reignited very quickly because of the prior brutality base. Whereas like in this form of warfare, you're destroying the body of the opposing side, but you're not actually aiming to induce mass death necessarily among the enemy. You just want to destroy the other government's ability to govern and the other army's ability to run. So for example, if you're gonna absorb those peoples in to your polity afterwards, it's a lot easier to do.
Yeah, in VSM terms, you're essentially trying to destroy the enemy System 5 and then digest the other components of their organism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would maybe think it's like generating many non-cooperative centers of gravity would be more like shattering System 3, the part that like coheres the body.
No, but what I mean is that if you can destroy their System 5, they cease to even conceive of themselves as an entity. That they have total moral collapse, and therefore they collapse as an adversary. But yes, you're right. There, of course, that's an important part of it too. That's what you're doing with those thrusts that are attacking weaknesses.
I need to learn these terminology better, probably, but it's interesting to think about that versus the idea. And again, if you want to think about leftist misconceptions, and the leftist conception of warfare and political thought, at the end goal, the enemy just doesn't exist. It is not incorporated in.
Yeah. Well, like that reminds me of like something, because I've been re-listening to the From Alpha to Omega like Revolutionary Strategy series, and I think this is something you said, Derick, a long time ago on that, is that like, say after the War of Independence or something like that, there's still kind of royalists and like monarchists around, but they're just irrelevant. Like the war doesn't like mop up and liquidate every single person who ever had a positive thought about the Queen or whatever. It just makes them completely fucking irrelevant. So they can hang around indefinitely, but they just don't matter anymore. Or like, a War of Independence that like, maybe there still are Tories around or whatever, but nobody gives a shit because they're politically irrelevant. But you're right that like our popular imagination of that kind of stuff is that they magically disappear into the fucking ether. Or I guess, how do they do that? Do they all get killed or something,
Right. Or do they all adopt your ideology because you need them to cooperate? Because the one thing about making political factions irrelevant is you also don't need them. But okay, maybe in Marxism, the answer actually is the reason why you have a dictatorship of the proletariat is not to kill the other classes, but to make them politically irrelevant long enough for them to be absorbed into the mass of the proletariat and thus be invested in their outcome. But the way people talk about that seems to be like we purge them all. And I think you see this in leftist political instincts to kill each other.
Mm-hmm. You do
immediately because they can't conceive of what it means to incorporate different views. And actually, in the terms of the Bolsheviks, this destroys the Bolsheviks eventually.
Yeah. And like when you get like centrists and rightists who are just like kind of very apprehensive of what they perceive to be like leftist tendencies to hyperviolence, it's like they're kind of not entirely wrong to be worried about that, given the kind of rhetoric that a lot of us kind of throw around, like as acting as if we're gonna like just fucking put everyone into a blender after the revolution, and like that's even from supposedly moderate kind of leftists is actually kind of worrying. It leaves you worrying that the entire model of political success is just either totally incoherent and fantastical, or nightmarish, or both.
Right. The imagining of no political antagonism, even in a classless society, to me is ludicrous. That's like, if you want to talk about the most ludicrous element of Marxism, and our a lot of cancelists is like, oh yeah, we'll just sit, like we're just gonna sit in a meeting and we're not gonna have factions about how we're gonna produce and distribute goods. You don't think factional things are gonna? Okay, you're an idiot. Like, and it's actually one of the only thing the post-Marxist ever said that I thought stuck. There's a book called Antagonistic that talks about this, about the left getting over, its idea of post-politics, because post-politics implies that you've completely destroyed the enemy and you don't need politics anymore.
Yeah, which not exactly a reassuring vision of the future. The thing that was mentioned earlier, I think, Kyle, the notion of like smashing System 5 and the identity thing kind of rhymes a bit with the guerrilla tactics that'll come up here, where it's very similar to infiltration, but it's disruption of an established regime, more so than disruption of an enemy army. And so guerrilla tactics is all about like gaining support of the population, right? Like it's kind of hearts and minds stuff, and this kind of like infiltration stuff of like hit and run, developing a kind of ominous and threatening environment for the enemy regime, and so on, and with the aim being to disintegrate the regime's ability to govern. More so, not just like disrupting an army's ability to function, you're disrupting a regime's ability to govern.
Right. The first person they cite is T.H. Lawrence on this.
Yes. So this is also during World War One. It's just in a different theater, where Lawrence, famously like Lawrence of Arabia, comes into a completely different tactical situation and has to develop an original set of tactics in order to win. And this is what he comes up with in that situation.
Yeah, and I think that leads us to the interwar period, and I think this is actually going to be super interesting, but it's also going to be interesting because we're probably not going to be able to get through it, because there's implications and when we talked about Boyd versus Beer, that might make sense of why like Lenin works in war, but if you try to run a society off of this, it's going to completely fall apart. Let's start. Well, I mean, his first example of this is Lenin, and I think he doesn't use, these slides don't use something leftist jargon, but it actually is interesting, and it's in one of the most misunderstood and misused concepts out of Leninism that's unique to Lenin. It isn't nowhere else. It's not in Kautsky. It's not anywhere else. It's revolutionary defeatism, and why that matters, because most people don't really understand what it's about, which is why they like play this stupid game with revolutionary defeatism as if it's only about like your stance on imperialism and this, that, and the other. And what's actually going on is revolutionary defeatism actually puts the ruling classes in crisis immediately. And you actually have outside factors do a lot of the moral, psychological destruction for you.
Right. So the doctrine of revolutionary defeatism for Lenin was that in this situation in World War One, where the Russian Empire was fighting against the Central Powers, Germany and Austro-Hungary for the Austro-Hungarian Empire for the most part. It was preferable for Lenin to lose the war than to continue fighting it, because the war was a distraction from the class struggle at home. So essentially, it's not that he didn't understand that losing this war would be very violent and harmful to people in the Russian Empire. It's that it was worse to continue fighting it and ignoring the class conflict at home and putting the emphasis on the international war than to lose, right? Like that was the worst outcome. And yeah, so that's just to give everybody listening what the doctrine was specifically. So he emphasized this a lot in his politics and his rhetoric, and it was one of the main Bolshevik lines that to set them apart from other parties.
So was this also playing off of general popular discontent that the war was pretty widely despised anyway?
Yes and no, because when Lenin came up with this doctrine, the war was still fairly popular. It was that the momentum shifted to the Bolsheviks because they were consistent in upholding this doctrine. And so they had like a solid reputation for being for this point because they upheld it when it was unpopular. And then when it became popular, they profited massively from holding it.
But you see here already things that Boyd points out. You have an emphasis on taking advantage of crisis. You have an emphasis on being a vanguard on a position. You have an emphasis on laying your legitimacy on moral psychological factors. And you also have an emphasis on agitation in ways that's going to completely disrupt traditional social norms. So it's going to amplify crisis, or as we like to say in left terms, accelerate the contradictions. It's going to confuse the other classes, which it truly did. And then, and Lenin was also able to play, not just enemies of his enemies, but enemies of him. His whole strategy of using like the Russian and Central Intelligence, the German Central Intelligence to get back into Russia shielded is brilliant. Even though that one action probably in the long run destroyed the conservative factions of Germany being able to assert power after the end of the Second Reich. So, there's a whole lot going on there. And Lenin is brilliant at this. And the quotes that Boyd focuses in on shows that, like, all class forces hostile to us have become sufficiently entangled. They're sufficiently at loggerheads and have sufficiently weakened themselves in the struggle which is beyond their strength. So Lenin's able to totally disrupt like class allegiances in Russia, not because he's opposing them and taking them out by the force of the industrial proletariat, because that's not the major force in Russia outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Like, what he's able to do is have everybody so at odds with, taking advantage of everybody being so at odds with each other, that they're the most dominant force. Like, they were never the majority. Like, they were never the true majority force. They were just the largest. They were the largest plurality at one point. And this is both his. This is really his war strategy and his seizure of power in the Russian state strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like there's the thing here that points out that like causing or capitalizing on oscillation in the authorities, and like throughout 1917. Both the provisional government and the Soviets just start to look like a bunch of dumb assholes, and yeah, it's a great move to like capitalize on that, and you don't even really need to defeat them. Just let them fucking discoordinate themselves.
But now let's flip this. Try building a positive society on this. What's going to happen?
Much fucking harder to do.
It's almost impossible to do. Like, the only way you can do it is attritionary force, which is what they try to do.
I mean, it's that whole famous line, right, where somebody, one of the Kronstadt people is like, for the love of God, take power, you assholes, or whatever. That like they end up being the last people, or maybe it's not the Bolsheviks they were petitioning that of, but there was a general sentiment of like, please fucking somebody sort this shit out.
No, they were asking the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks at that time were against taking power. They thought that it was the wrong time to do it. And that would be the time where the Bolsheviks were actually the most justified in taking power. And when they actually take power, they're much less justified than they were at that point in time.
So that's July we're thinking of there, yeah, if I'm getting that right. But like, what a crisis and what a fucking sentiment. Like everything's going to shit around us. You're the only people who look fucking sane around here. Please do something about it. Like it's a hell of a thing, right, to have going on.
Yeah. So like, there's this point here that Lenin makes. I think this is basically in his arguments for doing a coup, right? Like why?
Hey, now you're not allowed to call this a coup because we're leftist.
Okay, sorry. Okay, well,
a totally legitimate democratic seizure of power. No,
okay. So what he says is, among the proletariat, a mass sentiment in favor of supporting the most determined, supremely bold, revolutionary action against the bourgeoisie has arisen and has begun to grow vigorously. Then revolution is indeed ripe. Then, indeed, if we have correctly gauged all the conditions indicated above, and if we have chosen the moment rightly, our victory is assured. So this was true in July, but it absolutely wasn't true when the Bolsheviks took power. The proletariat was vacillating just as much as everybody else. It was just that the Bolsheviks had really determined cadres who were mostly from the soldiery, and who were the best armed people in Petrograd, that they could do this. So his assessment of the weakness of all the forces around him was correct, but he couldn't just say, let's just seize power. He had to make an appeal to the proletariat as being determined and unified in order for this to make any sense in Marxist terms, which it didn't. It made sense maybe in a kind of broad strategic Marxist sense, but the proletariat was not itching to seize power when the Bolsheviks seized power. It was quite demobilized, actually.
Was it more just everything had degenerated, especially after the Kornilov affair? Everything had degenerated to such a point,
Right, exactly.
Everything had reached the most extreme form of degeneration and vacillation. And so...
And if somebody didn't do it, somebody else was.
And the Bolsheviks were the last man standing.
Someone had to do a coup, someone had to seize power, and Lenin was just the most determined person around.
And for the listeners, the Kornilov thing was that basically the provisional government kind of totally shit the bed over half allowing a coup to happen, but then that shit the bed as well. So it's kind of double stacks of failure all around for everyone. And then the Bolsheviks just kind of end up looking like the most competent people in the room and having kind of the slightly better organization than everyone. Yeah, they have the most guns, right? So they win by default.
Right. But it's obvious that they didn't have as much popular support, and we know that from their need to ban the constituent assemblies in 1919.
And also for the fact that, when the revolution was happening, people were kind of just, hanging around Petrograd, hanging around St. Petersburg, watching as sort of, passive observers of what was going on among these political
it was a
factions.
relatively bloodless coup because people just were kind of standing back.
So the raid on the Winter Palace was not a mass action. It was a fairly small maneuver.
And it was the only people in the Winter Palace who were determined to fight against the Bolsheviks were the government ministers of the provisional government, the bourgeois ministers. But their soldiers wouldn't fight for them because they didn't give a shit.
Yeah, they just stood back, and that's what's interesting. But so it's easy to seize power in that, but then how do you build moral cohesiveness afterwards? The only way, basically, in many ways, is force. This is why, all the Lars Lee discussions about Lenin always strike me as missing the point, because I'm okay, so what if Lenin wanted to establish a democracy? He didn't think he could in the conditions. We don't think he could in those conditions, and the Bolsheviks maintain power. so he wasn't going to. It's irrelevant that he wanted to.
Well, I think something that really like strikes me is that, you know, this kind of like vacillation was sort of characteristic of the American Revolution. And that was one of the major problems the American forces had, was that like a lot of people just didn't really give a shit about them. But if you look at like the French Revolution, the activity in Paris is like so starkly in contrast with what happened in St. Petersburg. Like the amount of mass mobilization and popular mobilization in the city of Paris is like completely different from what was happening in St. Petersburg.
In October, anyway. Yeah, it's similar to what's happening in February, but
Yes. Yeah.
It's not reassuring at all, right? And especially that like October still ends up being such a huge fucking influence on the left today. And like looking at it through this lens, and maybe even calling back to the previous episode, you'd start to maybe think that what had happened there was that whole process, that whole system had reached maximum entropy and had burned down to ash, basically. And like the way it ended up going was just the kind of white noise that was left at the end of the entropy tail. And it could have been basically anything else. Like, it's not necessarily a win on strength. It's just a win on, like, this is the way a couple of dice rolls happen to go after everything else burnt out.
right, which means that you're basically taking what is a good lesson in how to win a chaotic political situation, but then basically trying to turn that into how to build a positive society where there's no evidence that that has anything to do with it.
Well, expecting a positive society to emerge from that kind of maximal entropy heat bath just seems like a kind of Boltzmann brain kind of theory of political revolution, like where like the Boltzmann brain thing is like this hypothetical, like in a vacuum, if you wait 1 trillion years, a brain might just instantly materialize just from quantum fluctuations. But it would think a single thought and then instantly decay, right? Because that's just a thing that could happen. Random fluctuations in a maximal heat noise bath could just spontaneously create a very organized structure like a brain. But of course it would instantly decay because it's a brain floating in the fucking middle of space, right? And I feel like a lot of left strategy basically boils down to a Boltzmann brain sort of thing. You see it more explicitly with the like riot porn sort of people, or the endnote sort of people that like, oh, spontaneous uprising, riot, rah, 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 will somehow
Build the new society.
yeah, as if it will just materialize in the fucking vacuum from quantum fluctuations. And it's like, Boltzmann's point was like, yeah, this thing can happen theoretically. That could happen, but you'd be a fucking fool to count on it, you know?
You're basically waiting on stochastic chance over a scale of bajillions of years.
Well, so I think that in terms of like Lenin's justification that we read here about the support of the proletariat, or the kind of like a claim of a mass proletarian will working in favor of the Bolsheviks, that's a very specious claim that like honestly wasn't supported at all by like obvious facts on the ground.
But also not even concluding that the proletariat wasn't the mass group in Russia at the time.
Yeah, no, but the point that isn't discussed here is Lenin's sort of hypothesis that the provisional government had completely failed to give the peasants land that they had promised them. And if the Bolsheviks were to give that land to the peasants, they would achieve broad popularity. Like, that hypothesis was much more plausible than what he is saying about the proletariat. And honestly, the strategy the strategy that he is describing here and that Boyd is analyzing is really a Bonapartist strategy. And the success of Lenin was really premised on the success of them being the only people who were going to do the land reform. Which is a Bonapartist thing, because we talked about how Bonapartism arises out of the peasantry.
So what's fascinating about this is it means that Lenin's primary self-conception is fundamentally false. I mean, the thing is, I think Lenin does believe this, but it's also clear between this and the national policy, which the Bolsheviks continually have to revise, and not just under Stalin, but even in Lenin's lifetime, because they basically promise, if you empower your proletariat, we'll give you national autonomy but let's continuously redefine what national autonomy means and limit it. And when you get to stuff like Poland, they're just like, and no. And the reason why is if they had been honest about their strategy in the long run, the nationalists would have never bought on, because the goal of from the Leninist perspective and from the Marxist perspective, actually, the goal of encouraging nationalism is to encourage independence and autonomy and development, so then those nations can dissolve. That's the goal, which doesn't ever happen. We've never seen it actually happen, but that's the goal. So there's two ways where this self-conception is fundamentally honest, and this is why I was talking about comparing Boyd versus Bohr. What Boyd's concerned with, he's absolutely right that this is going to work. But what he's not looking at is how do you pivot back to society now that you've won? Because the Bolsheviks, there aren't many social formation. People don't really think about this, but the only other social formation that I know historically that is shorter lived as a victorious revolutionary society than the USSR is maybe Athenian democracy. That doesn't even last 2.5 generations.
Yeah.
Really.
So that's the beer angle, right? That you have to consider building a viable alternative, not just the way to defeat the enemy.
Yeah, absolutely. Which we'll see kind of in Boyd when we get to the end of this section, the end of this reading too.
Yeah. So that whole thing about the Soviet revolutionary strategy was framed as one of the three major advances in the interbellum period. The other two being blitzkrieg and Maoist guerrilla warfare. We're about to start a major section on the blitzkrieg concept, but I think we can summarize it here by saying that it's kind of this fusion of infiltration tactics with technological advances that kind of doubles down on this, breaking through by piercing with multiple narrow thrusts, rather than, the Clausewitz thing of identify the enemy fortress and then just throw all your shit at the wall.
They didn't attack the Maginot Line.
Mm-hmm. They just breezed past it.
Which, coincidentally, or not coincidentally, but interestingly, that was one of the main reasons why Hitler had so much clout with the general staff, was that he, being a good modernist, pushed extremely hard to do the most radical thing, and constantly berated the general staff for being too conservative. So doing this, end run, a very aggressive end run around the French, was seen as an evidence of his genius. And that led the general staff to trusting him in situations where they absolutely shouldn't have.
Yeah. So for the listeners, it's kind of another example of fighting the previous war, where after the First World War, the French built a big load of fortresses along the border, and then when it came time for World War II, the Germans just sped past them in tanks. It was yeah, fuck you, whatever.
Have you ever noticed that the French after the Revolution always fight the previous war?
Yeah, it's a thing. It's a thing that happens. And then the third element is the Maoist guerrilla warfare, kind of fusing the old Schwanza stuff with guerrilla strategy and fusing it with Soviet strategy, giving what is framed as a comprehensive framework for modern total war. The shared elements in all of these being the focus on disruption and surprise, and on the kind of moral degradation of the enemy, trying to shatter their morale and break their communication systems, break their kind of nervous system, more so than just trying to hammer them into the ground in direct conflict.
I will say, in a weird defense of Maoist strategy in general, which people will be surprised that I would defend, the Maoist positive strategy as a result of their guerrilla war is much more effective than the Soviet one.
Yeah, importantly, that excerpt that we read from Lenin that Boyd cites was written prior to the Civil War, whereas the Maoist doctrine really comes out of their Civil War.
Right. And the Maoist doctrine is like the whole notion of mass line, as much as it annoys the crap out of me because it becomes populism in most people's mind. But it actually is about reincorporating all elements of society that can be reincorporated into the political vision. Now, this degenerates very quickly into a literal caste system, but like in the beginning, it's actually quite smart. So, for example, when Lenin says shoot all the sex workers, Mao says, give them jobs and give them a productive education. Basically, it's a re-education camp, but it's one with jobs and stable housing and food, which a lot of these people had not had ever. Which is a different strategy than what Lenin does with the same sorts of social problems. And actually, another thing that's interesting, and I've always talked about this, is the Chinese purges as opposed to the Soviet ones, is the Soviets killed a lot of people directly. The Maoist purges, the political purges, we're not talking about like the starvation period. They do executions, but they're actually kind of rare compared to the Soviets. Most of what the people die from is suicide. So it's like it's social stigma shaming, and they're breaking people's social identity completely. But they're not actually, in some cases, they're not actually even trying to completely kill them. So it's a very different strategy, and I think it's implied in the way they wage war, in the context in which they did, because Soviet society, and in many ways, if you see Stalinism as like a sincere development of Marxist-Leninism in the context of the Russian Civil War proceeding into World War II, it's so awful partly because it's created to win a nasty set of situations that's created by basically by Lenin's own doctrine. And the only way to do so is to do what the capitalist states did, but even faster. Whereas the Maoist strategy, I mean, it kills a bunch of people for different reasons, but the biggest deaths in China are not because Mao is trying to kill people. And I do think people do have to look at that when they're making historical comparisons.
Does Boyd here will end up being pretty damn impressed by the Maoist guerrilla warfare? Yeah.
Yeah, it sees him as kind of a grand synthesizer. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll make for some good stuff in the next session. But no, it's another. I don't know. We've covered another third of the chapter, so I think we should probably start to wrap up here. But do we have anything else to say about the material we've covered so far? Anything jump out at us as needing to revisit?
I wish Boyd would look at why he was right more, because I mean I think he's right, but a lot of his he like so many people who are war thinkers, they're political determinists, and so he's not looking at the context for why these things existed, except for a few points where he does talk about the limits of aristocratic thinking, but he doesn't look at like Soviet strategy as emerging out of the particular Soviet context, and he actually doesn't, and he takes Lenin at his word weirdly. I don't know if he didn't study the political context of the economic context of the USSR. I mean, that's a lot to ask someone to study. But it feels like that would be important if you're trying to deduce things for what to do in the United States with its military.
Is this just his idealism that we were critiquing in the previous episode? Maybe? There's something else going on?
Yeah, I think it gets back to that political determinism you were talking about, Derick, right? That, like, if you are a political determinist, then it's very easy to take Lenin at his word, because he is very definite in his pronouncements about political situations, and not entirely single-minded in what he does, but has a kind of determination that is sort of veers in and out of being brilliant and being totally crackpot. And so, yeah, if you're a political determinist, you're probably going to be kind of taken with Lenin and his writing.
It's very easy to be taken in by. Also, he writes simpler. I mean, if you read Lenin can make these statements sometimes about very complicated subjects, of which things have changed, but you can get into the confidence and clarity in which he states them. Even if you read Engels, who's a clearer writer than Marx, you don't ever get that out of the pre-Kautskyite socialist set. They don't write that way. They're way more abstract. Even when they're brilliant, they're not simple. I mean, the Brumaire, for example, is brilliant and easy to read, but it's actually not a simple text. So
here's an offhand thought. I think the political determinism stuff is off. My theory as to why it's appealing is because it's something that when people come across this stuff, they feel like they can actually act on it, whereas the curse of a systemic understanding of things is that you often don't entirely know where to intervene or what to do. But it's possible maybe the Boyd stuff kind of gives us a way of thinking about that sort of stuff. Like, how do you intervene in a system to disrupt it and to start to tear it apart? And maybe that's not entirely... I don't know, maybe there's a similar appeal there in that it's... Here's a way you could actually do something. I think the political determinism is usually illusory, right? Its appeal is illusory because it just kind of leaves you thinking you can change things by sheer act of will.
But you can't.
Yeah, exactly. But for Boyd, it's more tractable, like that an act of force that severs the enemy's nervous system, that might actually work in a way that an act of political will may not.
Well, building a society and winning a war are completely different things, which is why I've always found this whole notion that you would have on the left that we know to do what the USSR did because they won, and and to hear that now also is kind of a joke because you're like, well, what happened? Did 1991 not happen? But beyond that, it's also kind of the wrong lesson because you're like, well, they won at winning a war. They didn't win at building a society.
Yeah, they failed miserably at building the thing they wanted to build, but it's like everything gets funneled into the event of the winning the conflict, which maybe is the weakness of the Boyd stuff as well, is that it's all focused on winning conflicts, but we need to bring our sort of other understandings like beer and stuff back in here to think more about how could you simultaneously defeat an enemy that seems to have absolute fucking hegemonic power over everything and also build a viable alternative that sticks around afterwards.
Well, he does get into this in the end of the chapter, but it's very preliminary, and I think that Beer's understanding is a lot more sophisticated there, even if it's obviously not complete. Yeah.
But it is interesting thinking about that and thinking about that in terms of leftist thought and what leftists want to do, because. Again, when we talk about all the instincts being wrong, on this, the instincts are extremely wrong.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing about this situation that we talk about with October is that...
it's almost not replicable, for one thing.
Yes, and also, we talked about the Brumaire being a complex text and so on, and I think that... Yeah, in the Brumaire, we get sort of the idea of Bonapartism, and I think October is sort of the most extreme form of Bonapartism, because it's not just that the class forces are in stasis, it's that they're actually exhausted.
The stasis has burnt them out.
Yeah. And so it's an even more extreme form of Bonapartism. But
which is interesting, not to defend Trotsky a super lot, but it's relevant to your point, Kyle. Trotsky once said that if he'd have been the head of the USSR, he would have had to have been a Bonapartist too. That there'd have been no way in that situation for that not to happen.
Right. And this is the point I think that's important, is that if you look at the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks, the Menshevik orientation was much more constructive than the Bolshevik one. Like, they had a vision of revolutionary construction that they were very stuck to, and which was more sort of like, in accordance with like Marxist doctrine, much more so, because it had sort of like a at least semi-plausible path forward for building of something, right?
Like the gradualist kind of transition stuff, yeah.
Well, not the Mensheviks weren't totally gradualist, actually, but
No, they just wanted to make a constitution and then like build up capitalism enough so that there would be enough workers that they could actually have a democratic workers' republic.
which is what the Bolsheviks do anyway. They just do it by gunpoint.
Yes, and the problem is that even though the Mensheviks had a constructive vision that the Bolsheviks had abandoned in favor of a destructive one that was quite like Bonapartist, their constructive vision was completely implausible in the situation they were in, because the bourgeoisie just proved itself too weak to be what they wanted it to be again and again and again, and they tied themselves to that horse because they didn't really know what else to do within the confines of Marxist doctrine. And Lenin broke with Marxist doctrine and did what he did, and it was a disaster for reasons that were predictable within the Marxist doctrine, and which the Mensheviks accused him of. But they also did not have a way forward. So I understand what Trotsky was saying in saying, like, someone had to be a Bonaparte in this situation.
Right. There might have been better Bonapartes. I mean, that Trotsky is not saying he would have been Stalin, but that formation would have been inevitable in that situation. Particularly, I mean, his reasoning for it was because of the revolution failing in Germany. But and to Lenin's fairness, he didn't think that he would be doing this by himself in such a constrained context.
Yes, it was only plausible within Marxist doctrine with a view of grand strategy. It was only plausible at the grand strategic level, not at the national level at all.
Right, but this strategy of warfare would have only worked at the national level in the context specifically of the collapse of Tsarist Russia. It could not have been and was not able to be transferred over to Germany or to any highly developed capitalist nation.
Right, and so what Lenin is saying here when he like does a massive fudge in terms of describing the state of the proletariat is kind of a problem that carries down the line for Marxist-Leninism, because it always represents itself as a sort of toolkit that can be applied to any kind of situation of class conflict, when in fact it's like a very specific thing that is like pretty dodgy within the confines of Marxist theory, and probably not a very good.
It's a periphery underdeveloped state who tries to develop capitalism under semi-feudal absolutism, without, and actually also from Plekhanov forward, they ignore Marxist own writings on the possibility of development in Russia. His letters to Vera Zurlik, I forget the precise Russian who also concurrently developed a similar opinion, but from Plekhanov forward, they reject that possibility of leapfrogging off the capitalist world and not having to do internal capitalist development. And what the Bolsheviks decide to do is they're going to do the capitalist development themselves as a state. I mean, explicitly. I mean, he uses the term state capitalist, and then he has to kind of backtrack and do sort of like social democratic land reforms in the NEP.
Yeah, but I think that the reason why Marxist-Leninism becomes a wildfire and takes the world by storm is because it is a solution of sorts, or a strategy to address the question of what do we do in a peripheral state if our bourgeoisie is too weak to do a bourgeois revolution.
Right, and so it becomes a model for how to have effectively bourgeois revolutions in the post-colonial world.
Which is what it reconverges on ultimately.
Right, but it's kind of useless now.
Oh yeah, worthless. It's such a frustrating thing, right? Like, and again, it's frustrating because the left is so fucking mired in this kind of stuff. But then taking this like honest look at that whole situation, the whole thing looks like a nested set of double binds, such that none of it could have worked out. Like, there's no good option anywhere that could have really resulted in any meaningful kind of liberation. And
then we actually supplant the history of other lefts, like, on this. I mean, it's crazy. I was listening to another podcast. The state was it? I'll look it up. It's a Regrettable Century spinoff podcast with some other people.
Measures Taken.
The Measures Taken, yes. And they were talking about how at the time Engels actually said the most advanced socialist party was in Britain, and how like nobody ever looks at that. Like, even when it's Engels saying it, they don't look at it. It's always there's a set kind of mind train where we even in the United States, where you're so far removed from those historical conditions, you like, okay, we look at Marx, skip early SPD, skip the actual Marxist party too because no one likes them. 1900s SPD, skip Bolsheviks, skip maybe, and this is where you start picking your faction, and then ignore the 20th century almost entirely, like after like 1945. So it's kind of from the standpoint of building systems or even winning wars, it's like what it's a very rigid orientation loop that's really easy to confound, like incredibly easy to confound.
Yeah, which is the previous episode, right? With the necessity of this like destructive creative loop of refining concepts and building up understandings, and that's just not the thing that's happening, right? Like, we have a strategy that didn't even work in the periphery being reapplied in all kinds of fucking places. We've lost track of like we've lost track of that early Marxist thread of like how to do revolution in the core, which seems like a super relevant thing, but has been dropped like a hot brick. And so, where are we in terms of observation and orientation? We're fucking nowhere. Where are we in terms of decision and action? We're fucking nowhere, you know?
I want to just skip ahead a little bit in the chapter here, quite a bit in the chapter here, but when Boyd talks about positive elements that will bring people into your System 5, into your unifying vision or your identity as a polity, two of the things he points out are, one, so ingredients needed to pursue your vision. Number one, insight, ability to peer into and discern the inner nature or workings of things. So if your observation and orientation is totally fucked, and even the most profound Althusserian wizardry is unconvincing to people, you are not going to have that insight point, right? And the second one I wanted to point out is adaptability, the power to adjust or change in order to cope with new or unforeseen circumstances. So not what happened in 1917 and not ignoring the entire 20th century afterwards, right?
And not continuing to promise the same strategies. I mean, I think, and I would love to say that this plagues just like the revolutionary Marxist left, but it absolutely doesn't. There's a brain worm that I think it has to do with psychological needs for moral righteousness, but instead of actually developing a functional morality. But regardless, it is anti-systemic and easy to gain, and I think we can totally see this without, as far as like politics is war. Corbynite labor failed on every single front on these. Post Bernie Sanders DSA continuously fails on every single front on these. It refuses to adapt. It refuses to change its talking points. When it does, it tails its enemy. It picks up its enemies' talking points without thinking it'll change its own vision. I mean, it's fundamentally broken as far as systems building.
Yeah, and like, I mean, it kind of cuts to the heart of this whole project, right? That like, I kind of believe and insist that it has to be possible to like talk to people in a way that they can understand, and to update our mental model of the world, and to be dynamic without that just being right-wing tailism or being some sort of weird bullshit. Like there has to be a possibility of that actually working, right? Like that doesn't collapse into like, oh, let's go door knocking for the fucking Democrats or something. It seems weird that wouldn't be the case, but yet I don't know. We seem to be stuck in a fucking loop here with this kind of stuff. And as to why we keep raising these critiques, it's because we care, and it's because I don't ever want to do the whole like post-left or anti-left sort of thing. Like if I ever do this anti-left shit, like you all have permission to fucking assassinate me. But
On it.
yeah, like because that stuff's fucking horseshit. Like the reason we're so fucking critical is because we care, and because we do think that this could be done better and could be done otherwise. Because if we didn't believe that, we wouldn't bother with this fucking shit. Like, I mean, I'd be wasting my fucking time doing this if I didn't actually believe that we could do this project and actually succeed, you know?
Well, to a point, what I see happening is if we're not careful, we're inducing conditions of maximal entropy for the things we care about the most. Which is why you want to intervene, because you're just like, no, you're setting an exhaustion criteria that's going to just tear through people, and their options are going to be bow out or actually become antagonistic to you. Which is the rational core of this post anti-left shit, which I think is shit, and I think it's reactionary. But I also I get how people get there with these kind of incentives.
Oh, I understand it. Yeah, I mean, like, how do people get there? I mean, they just get exhausted after, like, you spend maybe 5-6 years doing the Bernie thing, and you just pack up your shit and go home. You get tired out of it. Yeah.
Right, and it's easy. It's also easy for outside people to game, and people are like, well, why are we always discovering that left-wing politics have some weird right-wing hedge fund money? I'm like, well, have you heard about an ODA loop? Yeah. Like, is it not a good way to totally confuse everybody? Is to like throw out all these random, confusing forces that oppose certain parts that you want to oppose that may even should be opposed, but like from multiple strategies that they don't expect from you. Oh yeah, but you can never do that because your structures on how to do this preclude you. What I will say though is it's easier for rightists to take advantage of a lot of this stuff because a lot of their stuff is purely defensive warfare.
Because they're defending the status quo, yeah. Right.
They're not having to build something at the same time. And that makes their project fundamentally different and frankly easier.
It does, yeah. That whole thing kind of it's a huge fucking problem. Like, it's an enormous problem of like the fact that we have to build an alternative. That's a gigantic fucking expenditure of energy, and it's something. The problem reminds me of like I think it was like a Nick Land quote or something that like in his sort of thing. Capitalism is very impressive because to him it's a system that's building itself out of only its enemies' resources. So for him, capital is building itself out of human resources, and that's a really impressive trick. Is that like this is a system that has to struggle to survive using only the resources of its enemy, and then like you scrape off all the land shit from that, but the sentiment, I think there's something in there, right? That like it is actually extraordinarily difficult to build a system using only the resources available to your enemy. Like, and we have to build. If there's ever going to be anything after this horseshit, we have to build that new thing out of the scrap that we find around us. And that's just the fucking situation.
Which is how all prior societies were built, though.
Exactly. That's exactly.
But without any foreknowledge. I mean, that's one of the things about that Land quote. I think it's one of the last essays in Fang Numina where that said. He also accuses Marxists of being like secret conservatives because they're pansies fighting the anti-human elements of modernity. But it's
the critique of transcendental miserabilism. That's the essay.
Right, it is, and that essay is the one. Also, it's the turning point in Land's thought where he becomes reactionary, even though he says it's not. He says it's after, like
you can see it happen. You can see the gears turn in his head, where he's like something like, "Life will go on even if it doesn't resemble life." That like you know, that this is where he starts to go into like capital as an AI that will escape the planet or something. Is that like, and that we're the shitheads for not being, you know, into that, you know.
Yeah, for not throwing ourselves to this vitalistic machine of abstract capital. Like,
but his point about like, yeah, a system that bootstraps itself out of the environment of its enemy is an impressive fucking feat. And like, okay, scrape off all the land stuff from that, you're still left with like the task available to us, and as you've said, Derick, the task of all previous big revolutions was to build themselves out of the available materials in the environment. And that's just always the truth. There's no other way to do it. You can't like create something ex nihilo just out of your sort of moral convictions or something. We have to create it in the here and now.
I want to move this discussion into our next episode if we could, because I think it's important for us in summary to discuss in what ways Boyd's thought is useful to us if we are not operating from the assumption of either proto-state guerrilla conflict or interstate conflict. Because that, in many ways, is, I think, like similar to what you were saying about conservatives, Derick. It's an easier problem to think about. So I think when we think about conflict with capitalism, we do need to adjust what's being said, because we can't operate from the same statist assumptions that Boyd is using.
Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit. While you wait for the next episode, you can follow us on Twitter @GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook and all the podcast apps, so like, rate and subscribe. You can also go to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit and give us a couple of bucks a month to help keep the lights on and get access to our community Discord. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as Fern Vlog, From Alpha to Omega, Jumpsuit Utopia, Mortal Science, and Swampside Chats. They're all excellent shows and excellent folks. Once again, thanks for listening, and we hope you've enjoyed the show.